My grandfather wrote me a check for $150,000, and my family tore it up. Not figuratively. Literally. Ripped it clean in half. Right there at the kitchen table of his house in Marble Falls, Texas. The same table where I used to do my homework as a kid. Where he'd eat his oatmeal every single morning without fail. They tore it up and smiled. Like they'd done something smart. What they didn't know, what none of them thought to check, is that 3 days before that check ever touched their hands, the bank had already logged it. And I have the record. But before I get to what happened in that bank, I need to tell you about the family that made it necessary. My grandfather's name was Earl Beaumont, retired electrician, widower for 11 years, and the kind of man who kept every receipt in a shoebox under his bed. He lived alone in the hill country, about 40 minutes outside Austin, a white ranch house on 3 acres, a rusted wind chime on the front porch, and a vegetable garden he tended every morning in his work boots. I was the one who drove out there every other weekend. I was the one who took him to his cardiologist appointments, who restocked his fridge, who sat with him through 3 seasons of Jeopardy, without looking at my phone. My name is Rachel. I'm 34, I work in medical billing, and I have exactly 1 close family member left in this world. And for about 6 months, I genuinely believed that was enough. That loyalty was its own kind of protection. Here's the thing about being the responsible one in a dysfunctional family. Nobody thanks you for it. They just get comfortable. My Uncle Dennis hadn't spoken to Grandpa Earl in almost 4 years. Some argument about a fence line and a property survey. The kind of grudge that sounds ridiculous, until you realize it's just a thin cover story for decades of resentment. My Aunt Tina, Dennis's wife, sent Christmas cards but never called. And my cousin Brock, Dennis and Tina's son, I don't think he'd set foot in Marble Falls since Grandma Ruth's funeral. And then Earl turned 81. And things changed. I noticed it first in March. Earl started asking me the same question twice in the same conversation. He'd forget whether he'd taken his blood pressure medication. He left the stove burner on twice in 1 week. His doctor used the phrase mild cognitive decline, and I wrote it in my notes app, so I wouldn't forget the exact words. I told Dennis. I sent him a long text, 3 paragraphs, bullet points, the doctor's name. He read it. I could see the 2 little check marks. He didn't respond for 9 days, and then, out of nowhere, he responded. We should talk about the estate. Not how is he, not should we visit, just the estate. I should have seen it then. That single sentence was a map of everything that was about to happen, but I was too close to it, too invested in believing that blood meant something. That's my flaw, by the way, if you're keeping score. Toxic optimism. I kept believing that if I just showed up consistently enough, the people around me would eventually do the same. They never did. If you've ever been the only one holding a family together while everyone else coasted, drop a 1 in the comments, because this next part is for you. By June, Dennis had started driving out to Marble Falls on his own. He'd call me afterwards, casual, breezy, just checked in on Pop, you know how it is. I thought it was progress. I thought maybe my message had landed. What was actually happening is that Dennis had a notebook. He was cataloging Earl's confusion, writing down dates, times, incidents, building a case, and I didn't find that out until much, much later. The first microaggression happened at Earl's birthday dinner in July. Nothing big. Dennis made a toast and thanked everyone for stepping up lately, and he looked directly at Tina and Brock when he said it. Not at me. I let it go. I told myself I was imagining things. 2 weeks later, Earl called me sounding confused. He said Dennis had helped him sort out some paperwork. When I asked what paperwork, he couldn't remember exactly, just said it was financial stuff and that Dennis had taken care of it. The smell of that phone call is still in my memory. I was standing in my apartment kitchen, a pot of pasta boiling on the stove, the window fan rattling. That particular brand of dread, the kind that doesn't announce itself, just settles in slow like smoke. I called Dennis. He was warm, totally unbothered, said Earl had wanted to update his accounts, get some things organized. Honestly, Rachel, you know how he gets. It was nothing, just tidying up. I believed him, I'm not even kidding. I actually believed him. Look, when someone gaslights you well, it doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels like your own anxiety overreacting. Dennis is smart. He framed every move as a favor. He made me feel like the irrational one for asking questions. By August, Brock had started coming around regularly too. Suddenly, a kid who hadn't visited in 6 years was now showing up on weekends with takeout from the Whataburger in Burnett, sitting with Earl in front of the TV, acting like they'd always been close. And Earl, sweet, lonely, cognitively declining Earl, loved every second of it. That's the thing nobody warns you about. The loneliness is a vulnerability, and the people who know someone best also know exactly how to exploit what they're missing. I started visiting more, 4 times a month instead of 2. I brought Earl's favorite black-eyed peas from the Heb in Marble Falls, sat with him longer, called him more. I was trying to hold ground without even knowing a war had started. I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me in the comments. If someone in your family started showing signs of decline, and your relatives, who'd been absent for years, suddenly reappeared, would your first instinct be trust or suspicion? Mine was trust. And I think that's what they were counting on. Then came the check. In late September, Earl told me he'd decided to give me some money. He said he'd been thinking about it for a while. He'd watched me sacrifice weekends, vacation days, sick days. He said, and I remember this exactly, because I wrote it down that night, he said, "You never asked for anything, Rach. That's exactly why." He wrote the check at his kitchen table, $150,000. He filled it out carefully, in that steady old man cursive of his, and he handed it to me with both hands like it was something ceremonial. I cried. I'm not ashamed of that. I cried, and I hugged him for a long time. Before I drove home, I stopped at the Lone Star Community Bank branch in Marble Falls. It was a Friday afternoon. The teller, a young woman named Ashley, I remember her name tag. She scanned the check, logged it into the system, and told me the funds would be available in 3 to 5 business days pending review. I drove home with the windows down. The hill country smelled like cedar and dry grass. I was already thinking about paying off my car, maybe finally having an emergency fund that wasn't a prayer. I was 22 minutes from my apartment when Dennis called. His voice was different, not warm, not breezy. He said Earl had made a serious mistake. He said their father, his father, wasn't in a position to be making financial decisions like this. He said it wasn't personal. It was just what's best for Earl. He used that phrase 4 times in the span of about 90 seconds. I counted later. He told me he'd be speaking to a lawyer. I told him the check was already logged. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "We'll handle that." I didn't know what that meant yet, but I would find out. The following Tuesday, Dennis, Tina, and Brock drove to Marble Falls. I don't know exactly how the conversation went. What I know is what Earl told me afterward, quietly, over the phone, his voice thin and confused. He said Dennis had been very upset, said things about Rachel being manipulative, said that giving away that kind of money was proof Earl couldn't manage his own affairs. And then, because he was 81 and alone, and surrounded by 3 people he loved, Earl called the bank and tried to stop the check. The bank put it on hold pending a dispute review. And that same evening, at that kitchen table, Dennis tore the original check in half. He called me to tell me. He said it was done. He said, "Move on, Rachel." He thought that was the end of it. I didn't cry when Dennis hung up the phone. I want to be clear about that. I sat at my kitchen table, the one I bought secondhand from a Facebook Marketplace listing, the one with the uneven leg I propped up with a folded paper towel, and I just sat there. The refrigerator hummed. My upstairs neighbor walked back and forth, and something in me went very, very quiet. Not numb, not broken. Quiet in the way a person gets when they stop hoping and start thinking. That is when I became dangerous. The first call I made the next morning was to Lone Star Community Bank. I asked to speak with someone in their dispute resolution department. I told them I had a check that had been logged into the system and subsequently canceled under what I believed were coercive circumstances. I used those exact words. I'd looked them up the night before. The woman I spoke to was calm, professional, she confirmed, and I wrote this down word for word, that the check had been entered into their transaction log at 4:47 p.m. on Friday, September 28th. That log was permanent. The cancellation request had placed a hold, but the original entry existed as a matter of record. I asked if that record could be subpoenaed. She paused for just a moment. Then she said, "Yes, it can." I thanked her and made an appointment with an elder law attorney for the following Thursday. Her name was Patricia Okafor, and she worked out of a small office near the courthouse in Austin. Her walls were lined with binders, the carpet was industrial gray, and there was a coffee maker on her credenza that looked like it had been there since 1994. Nothing fancy. Exactly the kind of office where real work gets done. Patricia listened to everything. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she asked me 3 questions. Did Earl sign the check of his own volition? Had he been diagnosed with a legal incapacity? And was there documentation of any undue influence by Dennis or his family? The answer to the first 2 was yes and no, in the right order. The third one, that was going to take some work. So I got methodical. I went back through 18 months of my own records. Every text message from Dennis, every voicemail from Earl where he'd mentioned Dennis visiting, or paperwork, or being confused about something. I had a notes app entry from March with the doctor's exact phrase. I had a receipt from Heb in Marble Falls, dated across 14 separate visits. I had location data on my phone confirming every trip I'd made out there, and then I asked Earl, carefully, over 3 separate conversations, whether Dennis had ever asked him to sign anything, whether anyone had ever told him I was trying to take advantage of him. On the 3rd conversation, Earl went quiet, and then, in that thin voice of his, he said, "Dennis did say something like that. He said you were probably expecting something, that it wasn't right." There it was. Not a smoking gun. But it was enough of a thread that Patricia said we had grounds to file. We were looking at a civil claim centered on undue influence over a vulnerable adult, a real category under Texas law, with real teeth. I want to pause here and ask you something. When you're gathering evidence against your own family, sitting there at midnight, going through old texts, is it grief or is it focus? Because I couldn't tell the difference anymore. Tell me in the comments if you've ever had to make that choice. Patricia also flagged something I hadn't even thought of, because Dennis had intervened in a transaction that was already logged by the bank, and because he'd done so by making representations to Earl about my character that crossed into territory that could implicate tortious interference, civil, not criminal, but still real, still consequential. Dennis, for all his planning, had made one fundamental error. He assumed tearing up a piece of paper destroyed a fact. It doesn't. We filed in November. Dennis got served at his house in Cedar Park on a Tuesday morning. Tina called me 20 minutes later, absolutely livid. She said I was tearing the family apart. She said Earl was devastated. She said I should be ashamed. I let her finish. Then I said, "Tell Dennis to check his email. His attorney will have documentation from Patricia Okafor's office." Then I hung up. Look, I'm not going to pretend that moment wasn't satisfying. It was. I won't dress it up in dignity I didn't feel. What happened next moved faster than I expected. Dennis had hired an attorney, a guy in a glass-walled office in Round Rock who specialized in estate disputes. I'm sure he cost a lot. I'm sure Dennis assumed that made him safer. What Dennis's attorney had not anticipated was the bank record. Patricia had subpoenaed the transaction log from Lone Star Community Bank. That log showed the exact timestamp of the original check entry, the teller's ID, the amount, and the account. It showed the cancellation request submitted 3 days later. And it showed Earl's own statement to the bank, recorded because banks record dispute calls, in which he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that his son had told him the check wasn't right, and that he should call. That phone call. That one recorded phone call with the bank's dispute department. Dennis had coached Earl through it, probably sitting right there next to him, and he'd never once thought about the fact that those calls are recorded as a matter of standard protocol. Hubris is so boring when you watch it up close. It always looks the same. The absolute certainty that you've thought of everything. Dennis's attorney requested mediation in January. Patricia told me that was a good sign. It meant they didn't want this going in front of a judge. We agreed to mediate, but Patricia set the terms. The mediation took 4 hours. I sat in one room. Dennis sat in another. A mediator walked back and forth between us, like a tired diplomat. Dennis's final offer was $75,000. Patricia looked at me. I looked at the table. There was a paper coffee cup in front of me that I'd been turning in slow circles for about 2 hours. I said no. We settled at $122,000, plus legal fees. Not the full $150,000, but enough. If you've ever been told to just let it go by the same people who wronged you, subscribe, because letting it go is a choice, and so is not. I'll never tell you which one is right, but I'll keep telling stories about people who chose to fight back. Here's what nobody tells you about winning. Earl found out about the lawsuit. Not everything. Patricia and I had been careful about what he heard and when, but he found out enough. He called me in February, right before the settlement was finalized. It was a Sunday. I was in my apartment with a cup of coffee, going cold on the windowsill, watching the parking lot. He said he was sorry. His voice was very small. I told him he had nothing to be sorry about. I meant it, but I could hear something in him that hadn't been there before. A kind of exhaustion. A fracture. He was 81 years old, and his children had turned him into a battleground, and no settlement amount fixes that. No judge orders that back to normal. Dennis and I haven't spoken since January. Tina blocked me on everything. Brock. I honestly don't think about Brock. He was always just a prop in someone else's plan. I used part of the settlement to pay off my car and put 3 months of expenses in savings. I keep a very plain folder in my desk drawer now. Bank statements, medical notes, legal documents, just in case. That folder is the thing I never want to need again, and no, I probably will. Earl is still in Marble Falls. I still drive out there twice a month. The vegetable garden is smaller now. His knees aren't great, but the wind chime is still on the porch. And he still eats his oatmeal every morning. Last visit, he beat me at dominoes twice and laughed about it for 20 minutes. I let him. Here's the question I keep sitting with, and I don't have a clean answer to it. Dennis genuinely believed he was protecting his father. I think that's true. He looked at me, a granddaughter who'd been showing up consistently, and he saw a threat, maybe because he knew, somewhere under all of it, that he should have been the one showing up. That guilt turned into strategy, and strategy turned into cruelty. Does that make him a villain, or just a scared, selfish man who made a series of very calculated choices? I don't know. And I think that's the part that actually keeps me up at night. Not the money, the fact that I can almost understand him. I really want to know. If you found out the person who wronged you actually believed they were doing the right thing, does that change how you feel about what you did to fight back? I'm still working through that one. Tell me in the comments. Genuinely. What I know for certain is this. Paper trails don't lie. Records don't get confused. And a bank log timestamped at 4:47 p.m. on a Friday in September doesn't care about family politics. Earl wrote that check because he saw me. Because 34 years of being the quiet, reliable one had finally been witnessed by someone who mattered. They tore the paper. They couldn't touch the proof, and I will never, for the rest of my life, make a single important transaction without making sure there's a record of it somewhere that someone else can't reach. Stories like this happen in the shadows of every family. People get written out, talked over, and quietly cut off, and most of them never find out until it's too late. That's why I'm here. If you've ever felt invisible inside your own family, stick around. There are more stories coming. And every single one of them has a paper trail.